the cue that we got to kind of look at the small intestine, aside from the fact that, it's an organ that isn't talked about much. Because of that, it already intrigues me to begin with. Like, hey, why doesn't anybody talk about this, right? Like, what's with all the hate? And so, that was, of course, something that always intrigued me. But I never really thought about looking into it more deeply. And then probably the inspiration came from our colleague from Austria, Gerhard, because he's a visceral osteopath, and he works a lot on the small intestine. That's kind of like a big deal in visceral osteopathy. And so he would talk about the small intestine a little bit more and ask me about what do you think, what small intestine pathology is. I see it a lot, but we never talk about it in Chinese medicine. So that kind of cued me into, actually, maybe we should look into that, right? And so slowly, working on our trainings and developing the training and working on formulas and things like that. And then the main place that kind of gave me that kind of hint was then the lines in the Jingui that talk about heat of the small intestine and cold of the small intestine. And then figuring out what the formulas were that fixed those kind of was like, oh, wait a minute. So if cold of the small intestine uses a formula in which the only warming herb is Fuzi, and then if heat in the small intestine uses a formula in which the only cooling herb is Zhishaodou, then it must be that those herbs work on that. And then slowly starting to figure out, like, actually, this whole thing about food warming the kidneys, symbolically, sure, it's a black herb, it's the true warrior, the black warrior, whatever you want to call it. But how does it really? What really happens physiologically? What happens to the physiology, and where is it all happening anatomically speaking? And that's kind of how my curiosity was kind of piqued, and so. Started really working on that. And so years went by of thinking about it, reading about it, trying to find things. I mean, I tried surveying just the literature for things I could find on small intestine, Chinese medicine literature. I mean, classical stuff, right? Books all the way from Han to modern times. And there just really isn't much out there. I mean, if you copy everything that's been said about the small intestine in the history, the 2,000-year history of Chinese medicine, it's a long article at best. It's not even a book. So there's very little that has been said about them. So then I was like, why is that? Like from a Western medicine perspective, this is a vastly important organ, right? But then from a Chinese medicine perspective, we don't really talk about it, right? It's kind of like this little, this thing. And one pattern in TCM, heat relocating, heart fire relocating to the small intestine. One pattern for kids, and that's it. And then never ever anybody talks about it. So that was they'll talk about small intestine with hernias, inguinal hernias. That's when they'll mention small intestine. And otherwise they'll just mention small intestine for Dao San, for this kind of vexation, insomnia, kind of dark urine kind of pattern. So that's kind of like, wow, that's just blows my mind. Like, why would such an important organ, because in the meantime it had become clear to me that it was more important. Why would such an important organ be more ignored? And then I started to think about, this whole, how fire spirits, they talk about the kan and the li and the fire inside the water, and they talk about, and a lot of schools talk about the Mingmen theory and things like that. And I started to think, wait a minute. The reason why the small intestine isn't really talked about is because all the time they're busy talking about Mingmen. That was a hunch that I got, because what the function that they ascribe to Mingmen, and there are multiple theories about Mingmen. Now, if you're thinking that there is consensus about Mingmen, you are absolutely blatantly wrong. There is so much discussion and discord over the concept of Mingmen. Left kidney, right kidney, one's hot, one's cold, one's water, one's fire. Is the Mingmen in between, or is the Mingmen one of the kidneys, or is the Mingmen? There's a lot of theory about it, and so there isn't really a true consensus on it. And I think that it's sad that the lack of consensus is not really being presented to us in TCM schools, right? They just make it as if everybody's in agreement on what it is. No, absolutely not. Historically, absolutely not, which is good for us, because we divide and conquer. And so, I started to think, maybe what happened is that, in the development of Chinese medicine, because Mingmen theory obviously is a non-medical theory. I mean, it's a theory applied in a medical context, right? Mingmen theory in and of itself is a non-medical piece of theory. I mean, what's the Mingmen? There's no anatomical basis for it, right? There is no, I mean, Nanjing even goes as far as to say, well, the kidney is the only organ that has two. Wait a minute, dude, have you looked at the lungs recently? Because there's two as well, like, right? So I love hating on Bien Chui, don't get me wrong, you know, it's like any day, anytime, any chance I get. And so, you know, so obviously a lot of things were still under development, right? And we know that in Han Dynasty times, that's kind of when things started to get codified, written down, the things that they had agreement on, that's what we call the Neijing. But then a guy such as Bien Chui writes the Nanjing, which is kind of his little addition, his little commentary, personal commentary on the Neijing, kind of elucidating a few places where he saw some obscurity. Now that's great and all, but the only reason why he's so famous is because there is no second other guy's book that survived to date, right? Because he's the only first guy who kind of wrote with some extra things that we have today. But if there were 3 or 4 guys who did something like that and the book survived to current day, Bien Chui's position would not be nearly as important as it is now. Like his theories would not have become accepted as at par with the Neijing. Right? And so anyway, the whole Mingmen concept seems to be something borrowed much more from a cultivational school, you know, the inner alchemy kind of practices. And so where they truly try to kind of work on the Dantian. And you know, actually, Zhao Nongjing in the Jingui himself, he uses the word Dantian once, right? Which is, I hate that, but anyway, I'm like, no, you're not supposed to talk about this. But keep it just purely medical. But if you look at it from a medical context, what Dantian means to me is that that's a region, a field, an area with just massive, massive amounts of blood supply and blood vessels, right? That's why it's called Dantian, red. Right? And it's an area where just like tons of vessels are present, where there's tons of blood flow, and that's why that area has so much warmth, right? That's why you can store warmth in that area. You want the warmth right there in that lower Dantian, you know, that CV4 region, et cetera, et cetera. Imagine this is where your umbilical cord used to come in, and look how big of a blood vessel that is, right? And so there's tons of blood vessels still there, and so there's tons of potential for warm blood storage in that area. And so you develop that in the cultivation schools. I mean, I'm not knowledgeable about that much, but I think you'd breathe into that, and you basically try to get that circulation to improve in that region. I think that's would be my way of interpreting that. So anyway, because of the Mingmen concept, at the time that the medicine is developing and that things are starting to get a little bit more fleshed out and a bit more worked on, and a little bit more detail is brought into the picture, this guy comes up with Mingmen and then totally diverts everybody's attention away from the small intestine, and everybody starts talking about Mingmen, right? And so that's, I think that's what happened historically, is that people just used Mingmen as a concept to describe and to encompass all the functions that actually the anatomical small intestine fulfills for us. I'm talking not functions purely from a biomedical perspective, but the Chinese medicine functions that we would ascribe to the small intestine. I think a lot of that has gotten lumped under the Mingmen, and that's why people didn't really talk about